Good evening. We'll call this special meeting of council for May 7th, 2012 to order. I'll ask council to consider the recommendation that the regular meeting of council be suspended and the committee of the whole meeting be convened. Moved by Councillor Ashley, seconded by Councillor Guerin. Is there any discussion? Question has been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That motion is adopted. We'll move to the agenda of the special committee of the whole meeting of council. The first item on the agenda is the adoption of the agenda before you. And the recommendation is that the agenda for the special committee of the whole meeting of May 7th, 2012 be adopted as circulated. Moved by Councillor Ashley, seconded by Councillor Guerin. Is there any discussion? Question has been called. Those in favor? Thank you. The agenda is adopted. Under petitions and delegations, the first presenters are from staff and the consultant's presentation on the public safety building, and following that will be a report for information only on the referendum process. Mr. Roden.
Thank you, Your Worship. Tonight we'll have three presentations. Whit Mirabel, who people who have been following this process will know is the architect that we've engaged. Then he will be talking, hopefully, I think he has a PowerPoint, and he'll be talking about the process and the project planning. Mr. Grodecki will be talking about how a referendum would look, and I believe that he'll also talk about the alternate approval process, which is far simpler and far more straightforward. And then I'll be briefly discussing what I've heard from the Solicitor General regarding the ability of the RCMP to force a community into building an attachment building. And then, of course, there'll be questions and answers from council and people of the public. We are televised, and I believe that the number is on the people's screen, and also an email address if they want to phone in or email a question.
Thank you. So for those of you at home, if you'd like to email in your questions, we do have people standing by. Mr. Grodecki, who's first in your order?
Mr. Abel.
Good evening. Please make yourself comfortable there. There's a grayish-green button which will give you the sound. Thank you for coming up to Prince Rupert. You flew in today, did you?
I did.
Right.
Well, good evening. So I've been asked to come up and just speak about process, the stages of a project, and expected project timelines. And so the first slide, I really just have two slides. One is this diagram that essentially outlines the various stages of the project. It's meant to be read from the bottom up, since that's how we would build a building, from the foundations up. So that's how this diagram is structured. So at the very bottom, there's the first glitch on the slide. This is meant to read the pre-planning and programming phase of the project. And this is where we establish priorities and functional needs, and really this is the stage we're at now. And my firm's been hired to work with the fire department and the RCMP starting last year to assess priorities and functional needs and even look at some sites, etc. So what we have on the left-hand side, we have a number of sort of client responsibilities or opportunities. This sort of identifies the opportunities for client input and client review. And then on the right-hand side is kind of a list of the architect's responsibilities, architect and design team. So in this stage, of course, we're looking at RCMP standards. We looked at the fire department needs, municipal and public concerns, and so forth. And that will then culminate in a finished report to council, which will be evaluated and used to go to the funding approval stage. So once we get the green light to proceed then to schematic design, that would be the first of sort of 6 phases of the project implementation process. So schematic design is where we would prepare conceptual design and design development, and we receive consultants' design briefs, the structural, mechanical, electrical engineers, civil engineers' design briefs. On the client side, of course, the input is from the municipality, the owner of the project, as well as the stakeholders, and then of course third-party reviews. And by third-party reviews, I mean RCMP E-Division, who has they have a technical manual that, of course, we have to follow for the design of a facility. Once we get past the schematic design stage, we get into the next stage, which is called design development. This is where we refine and adjust the design. Structural, mechanical, electrical engineers would start to develop their schematics and define their building systems, which would be coordinated with the architectural. We also, at that stage, would do a more thorough review of the building code. Typically, also, this is where we develop or prepare the application for development permit, which is, depending on the zoning requirements and the planning department of the municipality, may or may not be required. Typically, it is required. So that would be prepared at this stage. Again, on the client side, there would be input from the municipality, the owner, the stakeholders, and again the RCMP E-Division in Vancouver. Then following up the ladder here, if a development permit is required, there is then a period for authority review for that development permit application. The next phase of the project after development permit is granted. The next stage of the project is the phase we call construction documents. This is where the entire design team prepares detailed working drawings and specifications. And this is the set of documents that the builder then can actually build from. And at the same time, this is also where we would prepare the building permit application and submit to the municipal authority for a building permit. Again, client input throughout that whole phase, including this third-party review by the RCMP. They actually have 3 separate reviews that they conduct during the construction document phase, and one is at the 33% completion stage, and one is at the next one is at 66%, and then the one is just prior to tender, which is at the 99% stage. And they conduct a fairly thorough review of the documents and provide feedback, all of which is just intended to make sure that the design follows their technical manual. So we, towards the end of construction documents, it's usually we don't wait till the very end of construction documents, but we submit for building permit in this phase of the project. After we receive the building permit, then the project is, of course, ready to go to the bidding phase, and this is where general contractors are invited to bid if it's going stipulated sum contract. If it's going construction management, and the individual trades would be trade contractors would be bidding on the project. But in any case, this is where the actual pricing is received to then be able to construct the project. The client input at this stage is to actually select the general contractor. Usually, but not always, it's the low bid. And of course, the owner then signs the contract or contracts if there are multiple contracts. And then we get into construction phase. Construction phase, the design team's responsibility is for site reviews to make sure that the work is being carried out in conformance with the intent of the working drawings and specifications. We provide clarifications and interpretations of the documents to the builders. We provide contract administration, site instructions, and change orders if necessary. And also we provide payment certification services, which means monthly progress reviews and issuing of progress certificates for payment by the owner. Towards the end of the construction phase, we start to coordinate or get ready for occupancy permit. That involves final deficiency reviews, consultants, professionals, letters of assurance, and of course coordinating with the authorities for the occupancy permit. And so the final phase of construction is where we consider occupancy and commissioning. Commissioning is when all the services are being demonstrated and fine-tuned to then allow the owner to take over and operate the building. So the next slide is then an indication of the expected project timelines. And so starting on the left-hand side of the diagram with owner selection of the design team, the phase of programming, which I indicated was is where we're at now. Somewhere in this area is where the funding approval takes place, and it's never quite clear cut whether that's exactly at the end of programming or whether it's sometimes we do schematic design so that there's more certainty and of what it is actually that the city's seeking funding approval on. There would be a costing exercise, of course, to make sure that again to gain some certainty over the required funds to construct the building. Then the design development phase that I mentioned, and construction documents. And so in total, from the outset of schematic design to construction documents, of course that process can vary widely in terms of the time required, but 34 weeks is not uncommon. So it's 3/4 of a year roughly to get from the earliest stages of the schematic design to the point where we could actually bid or put the project out to bid. bidding phase is typically a 1 month to 6 weeks period. And then, of course, the construction phase, which, a year and a half or so is again not uncommon. Again, there are many factors that can influence the time required for the construction phase, such as whether the contractor gets into winter construction or other things that might slow things down. But so overall, from schematic design to the point where the project is ready for turnover, if we allow 124 weeks, which is a little over 2 years time, that's a fairly that requires a fairly straightforward and disciplined sort of process. As I said, many factors can weigh into this, and we sometimes see that design process being stretched out. It's not so much from the consultant side, but it's the approvals process and review process that can often influence the exact time requirement. But that's pretty much the process and the timeline expected.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Yeah. Councillor Garon.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Bell. When does the site selection come into play? Is that before the schematic design is done?
Well, yes, exactly. The process I've outlined here anticipates that the site has been selected at some point before we get into design.
Councillor Ashley.
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe it's just that I don't know enough about how architecture and all of that stuff works. I'm trying to wrap my head around why it would take 34 weeks to put the design together, so I'm just wondering if I get some more clarification on that. In terms of maybe I'm thinking of, blueprints, and maybe there's more to it than that.
Right. So it is designing a building such as an RCMP station or fire hall or maybe both together is a highly complex process. And so through schematic design would easily take 6 to 8 weeks to get through the process, and this involves consultation with the user groups. Excuse me. Some adjustment to the design back and forth. 6 weeks go by in a heartbeat. Design development, similar length of time, especially if a development permit is required. That in some municipalities like Vancouver, that could easily be a 4-month process. I'm thinking that maybe Prince Rupert it might be a little,
maybe even longer.
Okay. I just thought, if there isn't as much, sort of construction activity as in a larger center, it might be quicker, but you never know. And then, of course, the construction documents phase, which is by far the most extensive process in that design process, which is where we create the documents that the builders will actually build from. And for a project of this size or type rather, it's not uncommon to have a set of drawings that would be, say, 100 pages, including all the architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical, could easily be 100 pages. So you can appreciate that takes quite a bit of time to produce.
Councillor Rice and then Councillor Garon.
Sorry, just for clarification, and I'm sorry if I missed this in the introduction, but can you define your role for me and the public, obviously?
Sure. Yes. So my role is as the architect. We were hired strictly to do this the pre-planning and programming phase, and also site evaluation. But and we got well, we were a fair ways along in that process last year, and then things were sort of held up in order to go through this public consultation process. But so far, our contract is strictly for this programming and pre-planning stage.
Councillor Garon.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Bell, are there already designs out there that could be duplicated in our community that you've done on other communities in the province?
Well, duplicating a design is not as easy as it might sound. It might sound like a good idea, but the thing is that every site is different. So unless you have a completely flat site, reusing a design that was produced for a specific site in a specific location and so forth, and specific client is really not very easily done.
So hypothetically speaking, if we found a flat site that was suitable to something else you already did before, then possibly we could use that same design and save a lot of costs. What we needed.
Well, in addition to a flat site, or I should have said an identical client, identical site, identical needs, which is I don't know if that's doable.
Councillor Rice.
I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I mean no disrespect to your occupation, but this is a costly project. And at the beginning of your presentation, you said there's a technical manual for the design of RCMP buildings. So in my layman's simple mind, I think that all RCMP buildings should be like a Walmart. They all look the same if there's a technical manual with a set standard. So I'm just curious if you could elaborate further to the public why this, I don't even remember how much this building is proposed to cost, but it's enormous. And so I'm just curious if you could dive further into the details.
Okay. But simply following a technical manual is not essentially a formula for a building design. These are just standards that the design has to meet. It's in terms of room areas, the type of hardware that goes into the building for the cell doors, the electrical, mechanical systems, and so on and so forth. But it's not a formula to actually arrive at a design per se. You still need an architect or somebody to design the building. It's like saying the building code. There's a building code that we have to follow, but strictly reading the building code doesn't allow you to sort of come up with a design, right?
Are there any further questions? Councillor Thorkelson.
I guess how would you? I'm at a loss. I understand that we're doing this, and probably it may be what we're all struggling with. How would we proceed to decide what kind of what the structure would look like? I mean, you have to select a site first, I imagine, but let's pretend we didn't, and I'm not talking about looking like from the outside and beautiful perspective, but an RCMP building, something like the diagram you had last time, which was, how many cells we need, what we need for a lunchroom, coffee space, what we'd need for the fire hall, and I guess a minimum and a minimum option that we'd be able to go with that met the RCMP standards, and a minimum option of what we would need to design for a fire hall, and not the bells and whistles option, right? The one, and so how do we? I'm not asking you what that would be, but I'm asking you how do we get there, like from here to there? Because of course, what the big pushback is, if we had extra couple of hundreds of millions of dollars in our bank account, we wouldn't be so concerned, but we don't. So the pushback is going to be from the public on the cost of this building. So I think, people want to have an idea on what I guess something that would be sufficient, certainly to meet all of these standards, but would be cost effective. Is it more, I guess, per, can you give you a square foot evaluation, or how do you do that? And then what we need for space, and I imagine maybe building cells would be more costly than building coffee rooms. I don't know, but to get an idea of what we would need, and is going up is going up more expensive than going out? If we can go up instead of out, because we don't have a whole lot of flat space, I would guess, around. And so those are the questions, like how do we get there? Is that what we get as a design team, make that decision and move on? Because when we go to the public, Your Worship, we're going to have to say this building is going to cost, the budget's going to be, $5 million or $25 million, right? Or $50 million, whatever. And so, of course, the public's going to make their decision based on the cost of the building and what it's going to cost them in the long run. I would imagine that will be a major concern, that the public will be making their decision on that, plus on the other information that we provide them. So that's what I'm wondering. How do we get from these meetings here, where we're just having a general discussion about need, to the phase where we're actually looking at putting some dollars, costs down?
Okay. Yeah, very good question. Well, that's the process we call the design process, really. And so from the programming, which is essentially establishes the needs for these facilities, which is what we've done. The next step is to actually do a schematic design for the facility, and so you need to you hire the architect. I guess part of our role still is to come up with that initial schematic design. That's our contract. And that design process is not something that we do in isolation, in a vacuum. This is where there's a considerable amount of interaction between the owner and the designers. And so our role is to provide a design for a building that meets your requirements. And if the requirements are to have a very functional, basic building, well, then that's our mandate. That's what we will do. In order to give you some certainty in costing, or for the actual cost of the project, we have a cost consultant as part of the team, a quantity surveyor, and he will then provide an estimate, a budget estimate based on that schematic design. And so there's back and it's a sort of a back and forth process, right? We provide the schematic design. The design is costed out, we can then make some adjustments to the design as necessary. And at one point, then, of course, it's at a stage where it requires approval to proceed to the next phase.
So if we gave you, like most people in this room, architects dealing with big, large buildings, and most of us do. So if we gave you an idea, say, okay, we have $10 million to spend, what could you come up with 10? Would you be able to say, well, that's an impossibility, or this is what you could get for 10 if we said, okay, 15? So we have an idea of what we're talking about. If you say that, 10 million, that's not even going to buy you a barn, then we know, we start knowing where we're at. Is it just an RCMP building? That idea, I'm talking about ballpark, not something we're writing down in a contract. Whether we can start ballparking some of these things.
Okay, yeah, I guess I should have said that in the programming phase, which is really where we're just establishing the size of the building based on the needs of the RCMP and the fire department. There's also a cost exercise that's being done at that point before we even start designing the building, and that costing is done strictly on a square foot basis or unit rate. So we say we have X number of square feet. Our quantity surveyor, based on his experience, will be able to assign a square foot cost to that, taking into account the building type, building location, and some of the sort of the guiding principles of say such as making sure that it's a straightforward building, functional, straightforward yet durable, etc., etc. And taking into account all these parameters, the quantity surveyor then comes up with an initial budget price, and that is what you would probably use to go to referendum or funding approval process. And so then that will establish the budget, and all the subsequent design phases will work to that budget. Now, of course, there are periodic reviews at the various phases that I've mentioned to make sure that we're still on target, or if we're not, can we get back onto target, or are there any compelling reasons to reevaluate the budget and either increase it or cut back on the design or scope.
Councillor Carlick-Pearson.
In your opinion, do you think that it would be more cost-effective to build one building or two buildings? Like we could probably save some costs by different assessments and.
Yes, we've looked at that already last year, and again, so many variables. But just as a basic notion, putting two buildings together in one does have some economies of scale, and it has some advantages. There are some functions that can be shared, not very many, but some functions could be shared potentially, such as, for example, a fitness room, possibly some meeting rooms. Certainly the mechanical and electrical systems of the building would be shared. Developing a single site, having a single set of services coming in, those are all things that could potentially save some money. Now, however, it depends largely on the site, and it requires a site that's big enough to accommodate both departments. What we found last year in just looking at some of the sites that were presented as possible options is that many of them were small or had other conditions that would require a substantial sum of money to just to develop the site, to allow those two departments to coexist on one site. And so suddenly the savings of combining the two buildings become eroded very quickly. So it's something that just needs to be assessed on the basis of a site, whichever site is actually selected for the project.
Councillor Rice.
Are you familiar with the college in town, Northwest Community College? Have you been in the building at all?
I'm not familiar with it, no.
If I could ask another question. So this is an idea that sort of came to me. Of course, we have to build a new RCMP building because the law says we have to. And our fire service providers are in really poor conditions. And the law doesn't say that we have to provide better conditions for them, but it's long overdue for our folks at the fire hall. So I was wondering if it was possible. I was thinking of Northwest Community College. It's built in a way that the building is it's two buildings with a little, I don't know, what do you call it? Breezeway, thank you. So it's sort of a one-level thing. But the roof, or the second floor, the roof is built in this way that it can be modular, so that if the college all of a sudden decided to burst out with thousands of students, that they can actually build a whole new floor without sort of wrecking the whole building. Like, it's designed in a way that it can be expanded. So I'm wondering if it would be possible to look at that idea, because then we could probably we could do it in we could have a modular building in a modular way. I don't know if that's. So it would be a vertical thing. As we become in better financial times, we could go vertical. Does it sound crazy?
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if it makes sense to design the building so it could be phased in terms of expansion? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's always. It's always a possibility. It's always a good thing to do, to design a building so that it can be expanded. Having said that, there are certain sort of minimum requirements that, of course, we have to meet for the RCMP. I mean, it has to be a functioning detachment. And, you need so many cells, you need a reception area, you need interview rooms, you need evidence storage, you need, office space for, so many officers and municipal employees. And I think the program that the RCMP, the actual program for the RCMP facility is actually developed by E-Division in Vancouver, and it's based on the number of officers that are on staff now, and it's based on the population of the town and so on and so forth. And as I recall, there isn't much space built into that program for. In other words, it basically meets the needs of the department now, with a little bit of room for expansion, but not much. So, really, you need to build that minimum requirement in the first phase. You can always, of course, design the facility so it can be expanded if need arises in the future, but to begin with, you need to provide the requirements for the detachment as it's been determined. Yeah.
Just to clarify, I guess the idea that I was thinking was that we could meet our mandate of building an RCMP building, but in a way that we could actually build a fire services building or fire services, whatever we need, in a vertical sense. I mean, obviously we would need bays and things like that, but could we meet our mandate for the RCMP with looking to the future of combining the RCMP or of combining the fire services?
Sure, if the site is large enough. Now, vertical expansion is going to be difficult because I know the RCMP has very stringent security requirements, and they will not accept anything either above or below their operations. But certainly, a horizontal expansion is quite feasible. But again, having said that, the site would have to be large enough to accommodate that.
Councillor Thorkelson.
Well, I've seen the RCMP or the city police buildings in Vancouver, and they certainly are up. They're not just out. And so we could have a building that does go up rather than out. Could we not?
I think for a detachment of this size, you could certainly anticipate a two-story building. That's quite feasible. Anything beyond that, I think, would create operational difficulties.
Please go ahead.
And I should have asked this when that RCMP fellow was here that other day. But what I was, we've been talking about. There's been some discussions about having one building where certain functions take place within the RCMP, and then another building where separate functions would take place that would be near, with the idea that you can have intranet, not internet, but intranet between the two buildings, and have your clerical staff in one area and some functions in one area, and a cell block in a different area. So is that a possibility?
We do have the RCMP present.
I wonder if Bob could add some comment there.
Good evening, Inspector.
Good evening. I'll speak to that as best I can. I'm not the security expert, but from an operational perspective, I can see that that's not very efficient. I understand what you're talking about, electronic file management and the like. Even though we are in an electronic environment with our file maintenance, there's still hard copy files. And so if you had your clerical staff and your operational staff in two different buildings, you would still have the necessity of going back to pull hard files when you talk about search warrants, when you talk about CPIC entries, verifications of people picked up on warrants. They all require the hard copy of that investigation. So there'd be a lot of back and forth. If you had a separate cell block detached, I think that you would see your staffing for guards would have to increase, because now it becomes a security concern where you only have one guard working in the cell block separate from the detachment. It becomes a health and safety issue for that individual. So I think that you'd see rising costs from that perspective as well. So operationally, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think when you talk about going up, I think that's a possibility. There are certain things that have to be on the main floor, and that'll be the cell block and those type of things. But there's, I think, the opportunity to put office space above. We don't want, not that we don't play well with others, I guess, when we talk about sharing buildings. And so I think a lot of what you're talking about, if you're going up, we wouldn't want another department above our building, like on this above where we're working below. So that would be a concern. But you say if they're side by side type of buildings, that would be fine, or joined by a common wall, that would be fine. But not building the fire department on top of the police office, I guess, if that's what you were talking about. I don't think that would work from our security people. Does that answer your question?
Councillor Thorkelson.
I guess the community has been talking about this, and I've been asked several times, why not have, if we have to do a cell block, right? And then I think you've partially answered that question. But the other thing is then we have other buildings in town that could be used for offices, right? So, the city owns, so if we reconfigure where the RCMP is now for a cell block, and then had the RCMP move into the library, or across the street, right? And that would be the idea where where you would have offices. And would that, is that a problem? If the library is already built, it's one of our better structures. Not saying that anything is going to happen to the library, but that may be a possibility. But and I'm just looking at that particularly since the port has given the library some money to look at various alternatives, thinking that that maybe that might be one of them. That is a city building. So just wondering if that kind of thing, if that would be a possibility.
Certainly, from an operational perspective, I don't think it works. I just can only speak from my experience. Currently, we have provincial members that are working in a different building, and we know that doesn't work. And so I see that's just a magnification of what we're already experiencing with respect to the disconnect between one office and the other, where they're still working under the same command structure. So,
Councillor Thorkelson.
Just a further thing to that, it's just because, we all live in a small community, so that we think walking across the street from the police station to the library is a long way. But quite frankly, if you're working in Vancouver, and I don't know how it's figured internally, but I certainly know how large the Vancouver Police Building is. And, walking from one end of that building to another end of that building would just be much further than walking across the street from the present police station to the library. And so that's what I was wondering, if there's an issue and we have some facilities that we could use and fix. I have no idea. Maybe it'll cost $1 zillion to fix up another building anyway. But there are some we've lots of vacant buildings in town, and the reason I was thinking about that is because they're both owned by the city and they're across the street from each other. And we think that's a long way, but is it a long way? Again, no, it is across the street, right? So you have to wait for traffic. It's not like walking down a hallway. So, that's why I just thought I'd be putting that to you.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Carlick-Pearson.
I was just wondering, Inspector, if you thought that the fire hall and the RCMP combining, into one building, do you think it would meet the space requirements and the needs and the safety needs of both parties involved?
I think the combined services building would be, I think it's a good idea. I think as Mr. Abel mentioned, there's lots of, there are reasons to do it. There are opportunities where we could share some of those facilities, so we reduce costs. The heating, the mechanical, all that sort of stuff, maintenance over the years would be cheaper. And I think it does, because they are your public safety service providers, gives an opportunity to do some cross-training together that would probably be more likely to happen in a combined building as opposed in separate buildings.
Are there any further questions? Thank you very much. We'll move on to public questions. Mr. Roden, have you got anything coming through?
No, I don't, Your Worship.
Thank you. I'll call if there's any questions from members of the public regarding the proposed emergency services building. If somebody does have a question, you're welcome to come forward. Good evening. If you'd state your name for the record, please. Make yourself comfortable there.
Hello. Hi, my name is James McNish. I just had a quick question for the architect here. I was just wondering if this time frame for the building construction is based around like Prince Rupert's weather conditions, or is it just a general time frame for building a building of this type?
90 weeks is almost it's almost a 2-year period that we've identified, and yes, that would take into account some of the unique requirements of Prince Rupert.
Thank you for your question. Is there anybody else here this evening who wishes to ask a question regarding the proposed emergency services building? Good evening. Would you state your name for the record, please?
Larry Golden, 1601 2nd Avenue West.
Thank you. Your question?
The question is, if we go to does it have to be specifically about this, or could it be about the alternate? So I'm a little.
You can ask a question if you like.
Okay. If we go, so we still have a choice between, or we haven't made this decision, this council hasn't made the decision whether it's going to be an alternative process or a referendum. I prefer the referendum, but if it goes to alternative, can we take petitions out, or does everyone have to come into the council chamber or council city hall and sign something, or can we just take a petition out and it says I'm a citizen of Prince Rupert, I'm against this, or I'm for it, or whatever?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got your question. Mr. Rode and Mr. Grodecki?
No, the citizens have to come in and sign a form. So a form would be provided by City Hall administration, and that's prescribed in legislation. You just can't use a petition and circulate it yourself.
But you're still. Could I be taking the form? So they were signing the form that you are prescribed. It's just not in your office.
I'm not sure about that, but as long as the form itself is signed, I'm not sure if another citizen can take it out to the community. I don't know the answer to that right now.
Mr. Roden?
I'm not sure either, Mr. Golden, but my suspicion is that because the counter petition process is a place where you need to show identification, is that it would be being able to allow someone to pick up the piece of paper and go off and get someone else to sign it and then bring it back. The certification that the person who signed it actually did sign it and it wasn't signed by somebody else. I think the people will have to actually come in and do it. But again, we're still in this process. We've got a long ways to go, and certainly before we get there, we'll have clarity on that for you.
And as a follow-up to that, what will we use for a base reference? The last provincial election?
Are you referring to the voters list? So you're referring to the provincial government alphabetical list for our area.
Or since you're coming in, all you'd have to do is they could just look on their own forms and see, yes, you're a citizen of Prince. How would you show you're actually a citizen of Prince Rupert, since it's not limited to property owners?
Normally use the voters list. Mr. Roden, have you got an answer?
We would probably get a current up-to-date voters list as we could from the BC Electoral Office. If you're interested, you can go to the website of the Ministry of Community, Sport and Cultural Development, and it goes into some detail on how the alternative approval process does work.
Is there anyone else this evening who wishes to ask a question?
Hi, I'm Alan Hale. I'm a reporter with the Northern View newspaper.
Please sit down.
Oh. All right.
Make yourself comfortable. Your question, Mr. Hale.
All right. So you've said that the design for the building has to be rather specific to the location it's going to be put in. Does that mean that the city has to buy a piece of property before we can go to the design process? Or just have one selected out?
As architects, I guess in theory, we can design a building on a piece of land that the city hasn't purchased yet. I mean, it happens in private development. The developer might have an option on a piece of land, and the architect carries on the design to a certain stage until that allows the developer to get past the municipal development permit process, and then once that's done, the developer then closes on the land. But I don't know how else I can answer that.
Are there any further questions this evening from members of the public? Yes, Councillor Thorkelson?
Your Worship, we're not finishing, are we? Because we had two more reports. We had one, I understand, from Mr. Grodecki on the referendum process,
yes.
And so I just was hoping that...
I just wanted to capture the architect.
Yeah, I was just hoping that there wasn't...
The protective services staff that are here. Are there any further questions from the public? Mr. Roden, have you had anything come in over the computer?
Not yet, Your Worship.
Mr. Grodecki, would you like to talk about the referendum process?
Certainly, Your Worship. The memo that circulated to city councillors and is available outside to members of the public, it's based on informal discussions that a referendum could happen this fall. The memo doesn't capture discussion about the alternative approval process, but when I finish reviewing this memo, I'll certainly talk about that. So staff has been requested to prepare information for City Council and the community as an overview of the process that the City must follow to obtain the assent of the electors to borrow money for a long-term basis. Several infrastructure issues in our community have arisen for which the City may wish to borrow money to address. The referendum process. The steps in the process to obtain a loan that will be repaid over a period greater than 5 years are, first, a loan bylaw authorizing the City to obtain a loan is prepared and presented to Council. The bylaw stipulates the maximum amount of money that can be borrowed and the purpose of the loan. City Council gives 3 readings to the bylaw. The bylaw is then submitted to the Ministry of Community, Sport and Culture for approval of the inspector. At the same time, the City prepares and submits the liability servicing limit certificate. The Ministry of Community, Sport and Culture has advised that obtaining the approval of the inspector may take a month for reasons that include the timing of the Union of British Columbia's annual convention scheduled this September 24th through 28th. Once the inspector approves the bylaw, a referendum or other voting opportunity is held seeking the assent of the electors. Other voting or the referendum is to be conducted in the same manner as a municipal election. Assent of the electors is obtained if a majority of the votes counted as valid are in favor of the bylaw or question. Council then may reconsider and adopt the loan borrowing bylaw at that time. A 1-month period to enable quashing of the bylaw is allowed to elapse, and what that means is following adoption, there's a period of 1 month for anyone to make a challenge on the results of the referendum based on technicalities. Following that 30-day period, an application to the Ministry of Community, Sport and Culture for a certificate of approval is made. The granting of certificate of approval by the Ministry of Community, Sport and Culture follows, and then Council passes a resolution called a Municipal Security Issuing Resolution. This resolution commits the City to borrowing money from the Municipal Finance Authority in either in the spring or the fall borrowing process. And at that time, Your Worship, I believe that is when that resolution would be forwarded to the regional district for their purposes. Possible dates for a referendum. If Council were to give 3 readings to a borrowing bylaw on September 4th, 2012, a suggested date for the referendum would be November 3rd, 2012. This would allow time for the legal notices that are required as part of the other voting process. If Council, for example, were to give 3 readings of a borrowing bylaw on September 17th, 2012, a suggested date for the referendum would be November 17th, 2012. This would allow time for the legal notices that are required as part of the other voting process. Please remember, staff has no way of knowing exactly when the approval of the Inspector of Municipalities may be forthcoming. The suggested dates should allow time for the referendum to be carried out in an efficient manner. I'm speaking to the alternative approval process. The alternative approval process is a process whereby Council may choose to seek the assent of the electors without going to a referendum. In order to do so, the process starts once again with a borrowing bylaw receiving 3 readings. And then the alternative approval process begins. I won't be able to cover off all the technical issues, Your Worship. I don't have them in front of me. But basically, notification is put into the paper. The forms, which replace the petition for eligible electors to come forward and sign. And what would be happening there is there's a 10% threshold. If 10% of the eligible electors that are eligible to vote sign the forms, then the assent has not been obtained. And so then if that there's a 30-day period for that to take place. It's very specific. If the assent of the electors is not obtained during that process, council has a choice. They can either proceed to referendum or choose not to proceed with the bylaw at that time. That's a summary of the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grodecki. Are there any questions from members of council regarding the overview of the referendum process? Councillor Ashley.
Thank you, Mr. Grodecki. I'm just wondering, and it may not be possible at all, but when we're doing it, if we were going to do a referendum process, does it always have to be done like with the voting booths, or could it be done similar to what was done with the HST and a mail-out ballot? I don't know if that's something that we have the ability to do as a municipal council, but.
Yeah, the legislation says, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there is council could adopt a bylaw, which would basically be an amendment to the election procedure bylaw that could contemplate expansion of the ways that council does do the referendum. If we were to proceed with our bylaw as it stands, it would be executed in the exact same manner as a previous municipal election.
Councillor Ashley.
Well, thank you. That definitely answered my question, because I was wondering if it was a possibility. And the reason that I bring it up, and I mean, obviously we haven't had the discussion about what we would do because it's a little bit premature at this point. But we know that there are costs to having a referendum, so I was looking at maybe a way of doing it in a less expensive way. But it's just, I wondered if we had the option.
Councillor Thorkelson.
I just wanted to get a little bit of clarity on what Mr. Grodecki said. You said we could amend our bylaw, but would it be in addition to the normal or instead of, or do you know?
When I answered the question, I assumed it would be a mail ballot in addition to. I'm not sure if, and I suspect not, but I don't know that you can have a referendum only with mail-in ballots.
Councillor Thorkelson.
I just had one more question. You may have said it, and I just may not have caught it. And that alternative approval process, do you have to do the same ministerial? You still have to do the same ministerial approval, inspector approval of, yeah.
That's correct.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Grodecki? Mr. Roden, have you received any questions via computer?
No, I haven't, Your Worship.
Thank you. Is there anything further this evening from any members of the staff?
Yes, Your Worship. The final question that was meant to be responded to tonight was, when do we have to make all of this happen? People are probably aware that the city has to follow the Police Act, and we also have to follow the Municipal Province Police Unit Agreement, which was recently signed. The new agreement with the province has reduced the number of letters that the city will receive from the RCMP. We're now down to 2. So the timeline has shortened a little bit. We received 1 letter last year. It may well be because we haven't done anything to the RCMP detachments to address most of the issues that the RCMP have set out in the previous letter, that we will probably get a letter this year also. I contacted the Solicitor General Department and received an email back from the Executive Director, who notes that as per the Municipal Police Unit Agreement, the municipality is responsible for providing suitable accommodation for the municipal force, and also must resolve identified deficiencies. This resolution process with the RCMP is generally the responsibility of the municipality, and the province doesn't normally get involved. And he stated that because under the Police Act and under the contract that we have, there is a role for the provincial government should a municipality not address the issue and with the RCMP. He does note that as far as he is aware, there has never, this portion of the act or the contract has never been invoked, and that municipalities have been reasonably successful in negotiating with the RCMP on needed changes. And in fact, there are a number of other municipalities who apparently are in somewhat similar boats as Prince Rupert, where the detachments are seen to be deficient by the RCMP, and the municipalities are trying to negotiate, address some of the issues. So the question as to when does this have to be resolved one way or another is therefore a bit open-ended. If we assume that we get a letter this year, then any time after that, the presumably Canada and the province could get involved. The indications I've been receiving is that they would say to us, well, can't you and the RCMP come to an agreement on what needs to be done and when will it be done? So we may have a bit of time yet. And I'm sorry it's a bit vague, but that's the nature of the language.
Well, thank you for your report. It should be noted that Prince Rupert is a community of firsts. Started a long time ago with the purchase of a fire truck and then the reading of the Riot Act more times in this community than anywhere else in Canada. But despite the vagueness of your report, there's some understanding there. Thank you. Councillor Garon, Councillor Rice, Councillor Thorkelson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I guess it's a question for staff through you, Your Worship. Are other municipalities or projects with the RCMP going to have a 3P process, or are most of them going on their own? Do you know that?
Mr. Roden?
I phoned the provincial government about the whole 3P process when I was doing some investigation on how this could be financed. And essentially, the woman I talked to, and I'll certainly be making a formal report on it at, I believe, our next meeting, but she said that an RCMP station or a fire department or a combined version, the size, first off, the size isn't big enough. They like looking at projects in the hundreds of millions. And the reasoning is that the lawyers, the contracts are huge and very, very complex. The other thing is that the 3P is the piece that's often missed is the transfer of risk. Okay, the when you hear about oh yes, they did a 3P project on the new bridge down in Vancouver. What they also did is they transferred part of the risk of the financing and the recovering of the costs of the bridge, and the contractor basically will receive more money if the bridge gets used more, right? And so there's an offsetting portion of the risk of financing over the life of the project. And quite frankly, neither the RCMP nor the fire department are very good at generating money. And so there's not much risk that you could transfer.
Well, the reason I asked is that I was reading that the A Division headquarters in Surrey, I believe it is, was entered into a 3P with the Green Timbers Accommodation Partners, and anyways, it's a $966 million building housing 2,700 RCMP division personnel. So I'm just curious to find out, or just curious, curiosity made me ask the question, but I understand that it's probably more suited to a larger finance project.
Councillor Rice.
Well, I now have three questions, or two statements, one question. So I understand what a 3P project is, and I understand the whole letter system, but I'm thinking sometimes we can dialogue and hear in a language that we understand that the public might. So we might want to just reiterate how the letter process works, how you issue, maybe Mr. Roden could do that, and explain just how a 3P or PPP project would work. But my question is, And Inspector Kilberry, I'm not proposing anything. I'm just thinking worst case scenarios. Are there examples of municipalities that have just simply refused to pay or build the building, and what are the consequences?
The Summerland came pretty close. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Bob?
Inspector?
Sure. My understanding of what happened in Summerland is that they declined. They weren't going to repair the building, and the RCMP said, well, fine, if you need the police, they'll be at Penticton. And hence they're building a building.
Thank you, Inspector. Councillor Thorkelson.
I don't know who can answer this question, but it's another one of these what-if questions. And I should have asked it when we had that young fellow from the RCMP who seemed to know more about the RCMP building code. But
we have a young fellow from the RCMP here.
Good. But I just couldn't remember his name. So thank you, Inspector Kilberry. I'm sure that you're equally as young. What I wanted to know was if we didn't completely build you a new building, the RCMP a new building, does that police building code kick in if we were just renovating? And so, like, is the building grandfathered, not needing certain things because it's an old building, or as soon as you start renovating, do you now have to come up with the new standards? So if they say you have to have X amount of space per officer, let's say that's a standard, and we decide that we are just going to renovate and meet the cell specifications and meet the heating specifications, but maybe not meet the space per officer. I'm just giving an example as an example. Would that be permitted, or do you once you start turning a screwdriver, do you now have to abide by all of the requirements under? I've been calling it the police building code. I don't know. That's just appeared to me what he was talking about. But the building requirements under whatever that building code is that we spoke about 2 meetings ago, I think.
Inspector and or Mr. Val. Certainly, if you'd like to come forward, sir.
I'll try to answer some of that.
You may both have comments. Yeah. The technical security portions are non-negotiable. So regardless of whether you're renovating or building new, they have to be what they are. So that when you're talking about space allocation, are you talking two different things? You're talking one is something that's determined by asset management. They have a formula that they base on the number of people working in the building, what your maximum shift strength is at any one time, and then they do their calculation as to what you require to work in a police office for that size and the number of people working in it. Things like we talk about the cell block, they'll have very specific specifications that it must be built to, and they, again, as I said, are non-negotiable. Things like the interview rooms have specifications that they have to be built to. The breathalyzer room, all those things that currently are not in place in the current building. So the renovation or rebuild of that particular area would be very extensive, and I'm suggesting very expensive. So I'm hoping that kind of answers your question.
Yes, I just wonder if new or renovations had different standards.
Thank you, Inspector.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. Certainly the technical standards have to be met as soon as you start renovating a building. You need to bring it up to those standards. And in my experience, I mean, depending on the age of the building, but once you start getting into extensive renovations on a building, it becomes very, very expensive, and you're really not saving anything by keeping an old building.
Councillor Thorkelson.
I guess what the discussion certainly is whether is that issue, and I know you addressed it before about whether renovating something or building anew was cheaper, and you made that remark earlier. But people, including myself, have been wondering that maybe there's certain things that you would have to meet and other things that we could keep the old building for, which I guess is also the question of reason I was asking that same question earlier about a cell block or something on one side and putting offices somewhere else, right? And whether that could work or not. Particularly with Councillor Rice's suggestion of a modular building, whether maybe we can go in stages or something like that, if that wasn't going to add a lot of cost. But that's what I sort of want to know, if you could house the RCMP in something that was better than they had now, but maybe not up to in the offices and meeting rooms and that kind of thing, that maybe that might be less than optimum, but have the things that are actually required living up to the optimum, the whatever their, I call it code, but standards, I guess.
Well, in terms of space standards, and I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. That's something that the asset management unit would have to answer.
Thank you very much. Councillor Rice.
I just want to paraphrase with what I think Councillor Thorkelson is asking and saying, and I have to put things in simple terms for my mind. So I was thinking about a house I owned once, and there was once a carport, and the owner before me ripped down the carport part, the structure part, but because the setback was so close to the sidewalk, when I wanted to put the carport shelter back on, the law said, sorry, you would need to set it back this many feet, and it ended up being a big expensive project, and I had to get dump trucks and gravel, and so I never got the carport. I just had a space. But had the carport structure never been ripped down, even though it doesn't meet current code, I technically could still have it. So I'm wondering if the question is, or now I'm wondering, are there things, not that I really want to skimp, I'm just putting all the cards and exploring all the options. I really don't want to shortchange anyone. Are there things that are mandatory, and are there things that are nice to have? And what are those? And if the question is the question that once we start building new, then we actually have to meet all these new standards. But if we actually renovate, we might only have to meet half those standards. Is that the question?
Yeah, but I think the answer that I understood that is once you turn a screwdriver, then you have to fix the building up to snuff, up to standard, right? So, and the question I was wondering, are some standards, Officer Kilbury said, if anything to do with security is you can't mess around with. Now I'm wondering if you can mess around with things like square footage, another building, those other kinds of things that might not be as desirable, is so that we would create a secure building for the security needs, and then an office building that would be, I know it's not very desirable, but it may bring the cost down. That you could add to the cell block secure facility later, if that cut your costs down. I also don't know if actually, putting an addition on is actually in future going to be, tremendously expensive or not. And those kinds of questions. Trying to find some way, struggling to find some ideas to see if there are possibilities. The idea is meet the standard in one building for what you really need to do and keep people secure, and the RCMP staff secure, and the people that we're holding secure, and then have another place that's less that is an office building for people to do office work, and whether that would be completely inconvenient and a completely dopey idea, because we would have to hire 5 more secretaries, or office staff, or whether it would be something, if you had an intranet, whether it would work or not, and some, anyway, that's what I was looking at. But I think and what I understood, I think, from Mr. LaBelle is that we'd actually have to ask RCMP assets if you could have one building that would not be up to standards, and another building, that your secure building, that was up to standards. I think that's what Mr. LaBelle said.
Certainly, Mr. LaBelle. Would you like to come forward?
Just one more comment to the idea of renovating or upgrading the existing building. Last time we had some slides on the wall to show the site of the existing RCMP building. We have to remember the logistics of actually carrying out a renovation. The RCMP detachment has to continue to operate for obvious reasons, and to actually carry out work, extensive amount of renovation work in that existing facility is, I would say, all but impossible.
Councillor Carlick-Pearson. Councillor Guerin.
Thank you. I was just going to make a comment, and I think Mr. Abel kind of answered that, or said the comment I was going to say, but I think in reality we have a building that doesn't meet the RCMP standards, whether we like it or not. We have to find a site. I don't think we're going to find a site in Prince Rupert that's big enough to house both RCMP and emergency service buildings. And I think if we build something, we've got to make sure we've decided what it is we want, what it is the RCMP wants, something that's of good quality, and we don't need a real architectural facade on the building. It's got to be nice looking, but it's got to be practical and functional, and something that's going to withstand a lot of wear and tear. And as far as renovating, and it doesn't make any sense to move people to other buildings. You just have to start upgrading, and then you're starting from scratch again. So I think we just need to get on the process and figure out where we're going to put this facility and what it's going to look like.
Thank you for your comment. Are there any further comments? Councillor Carlick-Pearson, then Councillor Ashley.
I agree with Councillor Guerin in the sense that renovating any building is a nightmare, as a lot of people know, and you start tearing walls open, you're opening up a can of worms. So if we're trying to be a little bit cash conscious about where we're spending our money here, then it's going to be no different than buying a boat. We're going to keep putting money into something, and it's going to be never ending. And I've learned my lesson several times that I've been told so many times that you don't buy something, don't try and cut corners, because it always comes back to bite you in the butt. So I really agree that we should just try and move ahead and be cautious when we're looking at renovating a building that may not even be worth salvaging at this point, because we're putting there's safety at risk here. There's other issues that we need to really be aware of. So
thank you. Councillor Ashley.
Thank you. I definitely see the
Councillor
point.
Ashley, you were going to suggest expropriating the courthouse lawn, and we'd have enough room for both facilities.
Well, maybe a coverall building or something, but no, that's not what I was going to say. I think that obviously in a perfect world, we would be just saying, okay, we've got the money, we're going to build these buildings because they're needed. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that's going to argue that there's definitely deficiencies in the buildings, and otherwise we wouldn't be looking at this. And I do agree that renovating, and we did have presentations on the cost of renovating and that it can be a nightmare. But I'm also cognizant of people that come forward and say, we only have so much money and we can't afford to pay any more. And, at the end of the day, we may end up at the same place saying, okay, we've looked at all the options and this is really the only one that makes sense. But I think we really need to explore all of those options. And I if it means that we're asking questions and then they say, no, that's not possible, well, then that's fine. But I think we need to ask those questions because otherwise we don't know if those other options are out there. And I mean, it's one of the things that I think I would encourage, we have these public sessions. If people have other ideas that they think would work, I'd love to hear what those ideas are. It would be really nice if people started coming forward and saying, because we have people coming to us and they're saying, why aren't you doing this and why aren't you doing that? I think those people need to start coming out and coming and asking directly. Because otherwise we're asking questions, we're trying to come up with the right answer, we're trying to come up with something that is for the best of our community. And when we look at things like, is it possible to, add a cell block on without, interfering with things? I mean, these are options we need to look at. It's not perfect, but, sometimes, if I take my own house, for example, I might like to, just knock it down and rebuild it. Unfortunately, I can't afford to go in that much debt, right? And so I need to look at ways that I can live within my means. And so I think we do really need to be cognizant of that and keep in mind safety, but we may have to make some compromises. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. You are correct. People's comments, people's suggestions are invited. It could turn out that you have your referendum in the latter part of 2012, and if there is the assent of the electors, if that is obtained, you look at design, which you should have a good handle on. You look at pricing, you go out for bids, you may end up building a structure, either combined or individually, in 2013 or perhaps 2014 and 2015. And 2015 is when we should see some increases on the tax roll within the city of Prince Rupert, and that may help to fund this. Councillor Guerin.
Thank you, Your Worship. Further to your comment.
My comment or Councillor Ashley's?
No, your comment about
Yes.
things getting better down the road. I personally would like to separate both the RCMP and the fire hall as two separate buildings. That's the way I'm looking at this after digesting all that we've heard in the last year. And because the pressure is on us for the RCMP building, I think that's the number one issue. And as far as the fire hall, it is ours. It's a shame that they are working in those conditions, but I think that that's something that can kind of go secondary to the RCMP building right now. From what I've been hearing from people out in the public, unfortunately, we've got someone breathing down our back to build a new building. Whether we build it or not, someone else will, and we're going to have to pay for it. So I'd like to get moving on getting down the road on finding a spot for an RCMP division.
Thank you for your comment. Councillor Thorkelson.
Well, I just had a couple of one general question, and that is, I can't remember on the agenda, and
Is this of the architect?
Nope.
No.
It's you or Mr. Roden, or maybe the architect. I just couldn't remember which meeting that we're supposed to be looking at sites. One of those on the list of items that we're going to look at. One of those meetings of sites, and I can't remember.
Mr. Roden.
Hey, Your Worship, we have 2 more meetings scheduled this spring. On June the 4th, we're going to be talking about how a building or buildings could be financed. Mr. Abel and possibly Mr. Spugall, who is the quantity surveyor, will be in attendance, and they'll give us the estimated project costs for construction, renovation, the costs of or cost increases of one building or 2, and then I'll start discussing public-private partnerships and our financial position and future development. And as you've just mentioned, the possibility that in 2014 we may see some things on the tax roll, which may mean funding this could be a whole lot easier. The June 18th the June 18th meeting will be when we discuss where would the building be located, and again, I'm hoping Mr. Abil and Mr. Horn will be here, because Mr. Horn is very familiar with the local sites and can talk about site development costs. And then Mr. Kilberry and people from the RCMP, asset management, Eric Miller, who was the gentleman who had all the security knowledge. Hopefully he'll be coming back to talk about security concerns again, about different sites, centrality, arterial roads. And that'll conclude the discussion on this topic until council decides to take another step.
Thank you. Councillor Thorkelson.
Just on that, then this is a question for the it could be Mr. LaBelle, but it's about the fire department, and I just wanted an answer to the question that I asked a couple of weeks ago, and is that if we had a volunteer firefighter department or an auxiliary fire department or a half and half firefighter department, whatever that one's called, do you need a smaller facility?
Chief Mackenzie, good evening.
Good evening. Actually, you probably need a building of the same size, if not bigger, to accommodate the amount of staff that you would have in the building and require training compared to what we would need for a professional hall, just career staff.
Councillor Thorkelson.
Why would the building have to be the same size or bigger?
Potentially your staffing for paid on calls is there's more manpower needed for a paid on call compared to a career staff. It's usually a ratio of 3 to 1. So for every career staff you need to have 3 paid on call or volunteers to fill that void is a standard that they're going by. So now if you start taking 15 personnel career and you make it volunteer, you're going to need to triple that size. So you need to have accommodations and facilities and training and lecture rooms and all that stuff to accommodate all that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fire Chief. Please go ahead.
So in my experience with fire hall design, there really is no significant difference between the space requirements for a volunteer fire department and career.
Thank you. Is there anything further from members of council? Mr. Roden, for the last time, have you gotten any questions over your computer?
I think there might be a hockey game on tonight, Your Worship.
Wouldn't be the first time we've been upstaged. Just before we conclude the committee of the whole meeting, Mr. Abell, I want to thank you for being here. Inspector Kilbury, thank you. Fire Chief David Mackenzie and Deputy Fire Chief Jeff Beckwith, thank you all for attending to speak to this matter. It is one of great cost and deserves as much consideration as we can give it. Councillor Ashley.
I'm just wondering if there was going to be another opportunity, just because there had been a couple more presenters, if there are any questions from members of the public.
Certainly. Are there any further questions from members of the public concerning this matter? If not, I'll ask council for a motion to reconvene to the special meeting of council. Moved by Councillor Ashley, seconded by Councillor Guerin. Is there any discussion? Question's been called. Those in favor? Thank you. We'll go back to the adoption of the special meeting of council agenda. There is one amendment there, and that is under additional items. It'll be item 4A, and it's a proclamation request. And at this time, I'll ask council to consider the recommendation that the agenda for the regular council meeting of May 7th, 2012 be adopted as amended. Thank you. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Carlick Pearson. Is there any discussion? Question's been called. Those in favor? Thank you. It's adopted. We'll move on to item 3, which is bylaws, and this is the 2012 5-year financial plan bylaw number 3323, 2012. It comes with a recommendation from staff that council adopt the 2012 5-year financial plan bylaw of the number and year just stated. Mr. Roden, could you give an overview of the effect of the bylaw if it is adopted?
Certainly, Your Worship. This bylaw will enable will give the city the legal right to continue to spend money this year. It basically proposes that there'll be a 1.5% tax increase, as directed by Council at the previous meeting, and the balance of the funds that will be used to fund the operations of the city this year will come out of accumulated surplus. And this is essentially the last step in a process that Council initiated back in October of 2011.
Thank you. Is there any discussion with regards to the matter? Councillor Ashley.
I'll move the recommendation that Council adopt 2012 5-year financial plan bylaw.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Guerin. Is there any discussion with regards to the motion that's been made? Question's been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That is adopted. Next for Council's consideration is the 2012 property tax bylaw number 3324, 2012. And that comes with a staff recommendation that Council adopt the 2012 property tax bylaw of the number and year just stated. Mr. Roden, would you like to give an overview, please, of this bylaw, should it be adopted by the Council?
Certainly, Your Worship. This is the actual bylaw that levies the tax rates. Each year, Council has to pass the financial plan bylaw, and then they also have to pass a bylaw that actually sets the levy for property taxes in the municipality for municipal taxes. Additionally, both the regional district, the Queen Charlotte Regional Hospital District, the regional district, the Northwest Regional Hospital District, and the Queen Charlotte Regional Hospital District, when they set their budgets, what they do is they simply advise the city that they need X amount of money. And what the city has to then do is that we have to calculate the appropriate tax rate for the various classes. So that's why they're also on this particular bylaw. School tax, Municipal Finance Authority, and the Municipal Assurance, they set their own tax rates, so they're not included.
Thank you. I'll ask Council's consideration of the recommendation. Councillor Ashley.
I'll move the recommendation.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Guerin. Is there any discussion? Question has been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That motion is adopted. Under additional items, there is a proclamation request. Mr. Grodecki, if you'd review the request, please.
Certainly, Your Worship. We received a letter from Bonnie Flan, who's the president of the Prince Rupert Hospice Society, and that organization is requesting that the week of May 6th to 12th is declared Hospice Week in the city of Prince Rupert. It's also declared on a Canada-wide basis as well, I guess, in various legislative forms. And I think the Hospice Society is doing some excellent work in the community, and they've got this request for a proclamation in front of Council for your consideration.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Thorkelson, seconded by Councillor Guerin. Councillor Carlick Stephen, or Councillor Carlick Pearson, did you have a comment? No. Question's been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That proclamation is adopted.
Your Worship.
Yes.
I'd just like to say on when we proclaimed the meeting that we were at, when we proclaimed the day of mourning.
Yes.
At the time that we were doing that and actually having the debate is when the fire was going on at the mill in Prince George at that time at 9 o'clock, and that's we had 2 people die in that fire in Prince George. So just want to point out that it was an important proclamation, and it was a terrible disaster in Prince George, and against a couple of workers lost their lives, and others have been maimed and injured. I thought that in light of that, we should maybe, and I'm going to move a motion that says that we send a letter to the municipality of Prince George, giving our sympathies to those people who are at the mill and asking them to pass them on to the union and to the company staff. I understand the union actually has a fund that can donate to. I'm not suggesting we do that, but that we send a letter to Prince George municipality and ask them to extend our sympathies to the workers at that mill and their families.
Certainly, thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Councillor Ashley. Is there any discussion? Question has been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That's adopted. Councillor Ashley.
Just in relation to this, I was just reading through because it was a last-minute item that this was on here, and there's some stuff happening, and I'm wondering if we shouldn't just let
Certainly,
people.
if you'd like to amplify that, go ahead.
So, in respect of it being Hospice Week, there is going to be a grief workshop held on May 11th and 12th at the Senior Center. And then Friday night, it says it will be open to all public free of charge from 7:30 to 9:30 at the Senior Center, and that there will also be an all-day workshop that costs $20 per person that includes lunch, and that people can register by calling Zoe at 250-627-8220.
Thank you. Mr. Roden, have you got anything further as the acting city manager this evening?
No, I don't, Your Worship.
Thank you. Are there any reports, questions, or inquiries from members of council? Councillor Ashley.
I don't want to have a discussion about this right now, but I'm wondering at some point, and I know we're quite busy in the next little bit, but I would like to have a discussion at some point in the future about the type of policies that we have at our dump regarding the way that things are being thrown into the garbage bins and stuff like that, and looking at different policies that could increase people taking stuff to recycling and decrease what's going into the landfill. So I'm just looking at possibly looking at that at a future time.
Sure.
So I don't want to put, because we have so many things on our plate, but it's just something that I think would be worthwhile looking at.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Have you got any information on the containers at the landfill which are put aside specifically for recycling? Are they well utilized?
I believe that they are well utilized, but some of the, I guess, just very briefly, some of the concerns are that, I'm just trying to think how to put it. Things, for example, and people have come over the last few years to give us different ideas of things that people have done. But, for example, at some landfills, they have it so that when people are throwing their garbage away, they have to put it in clear plastic bags so that you can see if there's recyclables in there. And there are also things where, maybe we want to consider, when I was over on Haida Gwaii at the landfill sites there, they also had recycling bins at the landfill, and that might be something that we wanted to look at in concert with the regional district as in terms of, again, decreasing stuff into our landfill and looking at those types of things. So it's just looking at policies like that.
A transfer station, perhaps, right? Okay. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just actually wanted to, I didn't know if someone else was going to do this, but I thought I wanted to let the public know that some of us had actually attended the North Central Local Government Association this past week in 100 Mile House, and Prince Rupert actually brought forward a bunch of resolutions. All but one was adopted by the NCGLA, by the rest of the communities in the north and the central part of the province. And I wanted to just explain that this is an opportunity for us to network with other councillors in the north and the central part of the province to discuss common issues and debate and adopt or not adopt resolutions on matters important to us. And a lot of these resolutions will go forward to the the UBCM, the Union of British Columbia Municipalities, which is a big convention in the fall where all the municipalities in the province get together and then move forward resolutions that we, in particular, we usually want to lobby higher levels of government, in particular the province of British Columbia, for matters that are of concern to us. So I just wanted to share that some of us were recently away participating in that convention. And I also wanted to let the public know that last Monday I was in Vancouver attending the Ferries Advisory Committee meeting, which is a position that I sit on behalf of the city. And this is an opportunity, I think, twice a year that we get together in the north, or communities in the north get together in Vancouver and discuss, again, common matters around BC Ferries. And this is a committee that is voluntarily put forward by BC Ferries. They don't have to do this, but this is where they heed our advice. So questions and concerns around BC Ferry and the network of ferries, routes, all that stuff. If the public has issues or concerns that they'd like me to bring forward, I'm more than willing to do that. And just quickly, if I could respond to the common request of why the fares are going up and are they going to go down in the near future? In a nutshell, they probably will not go down in the near future unless we have a change of provincial government. BC Ferries has explained that it is the provincial government's policy that has structured the payment, the cost recovery system in such a way that each route has to generate an income. So hence the northern routes, which aren't big money makers because we don't have a lot of traffic, the BC Ferry fares have skyrocketed because they are trying to make ends meet. And it doesn't look like in the near future anyone's too interested in making those fares accessible and affordable for most families. So my recommendation is, if that is really important to northern British Columbians, that we would actually have to have a campaign that lobbied the provincial government, because I don't really think BC Ferries is going to do that on our behalf. Again, other concerns, please bring them forward. Two other things I wanted to mention. May 24th, Enbridge hearings would be starting again in Prince Rupert. So the National Energy Board, the 3 panel members, will be here again to hear the concerns of citizens. And these hearings are for citizens that want to make a statement. So this is not oral evidence, which we've already had happen. These are people that want to give their opinion. So citizens that registered well over a year ago have been provided with 10 minutes to speak. That's between May 24th and May 28th. And in order to speak, even though you have already registered, you must go onto their website and use their online scheduler to actually pick a time slot for when you speak. So there's time slots between 9 and noon, 1 and 3, or 1 and 4. So even though you've pre-registered, if you've not gone to their website and picked a time, you won't be speaking. May 15th, the National Energy Board is actually providing an online webinar to help people get clarification on that process and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Again, National Energy Board website. And May 16th, Friends of Wild Salmon is hosting an in-person workshop at the Fisherman's Hall at 7:30 p.m. And that is a chance for citizens who have registered to speak, if they want some support or public speaking tips or advice, they can attend that 7:30 May 16 in the Fisherman's Hall. Thank you. That concludes my report.
You're welcome. Is there anything further this evening from members of council? If not, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Thorkelson, seconded by Councillor Ashley. Question's been called. Those in favor? Thank you. That motion's adopted. This meeting stands adjourned.